Hey, everybody. Welcome to part two of the chapter 12. I just forgot the number of the chapter. Yes, the chapter 12 lecture. We're going to be picking up where we left off last time. So, last lecture, if you're looking at these out of order, the first one talks a lot about social cognition and how the brain and intellectual and cognitive processes develop and how those affect social relationships, especially in infants and early childhood and preschool children. We talk about play and the role of that in the development of social skills as well. Now, as we're getting into middle childhood, in this lecture, we're going to talk about school age children primarily and what their relationships are like, how they're characterized, and a lot about how they are categorized and looked at and researched, because that's a big part of understanding how young people organize their world is as these relationships are forming, what kind of categories do we fall into? And we won't talk about it as much today, but it helps with things like predicting who's going to be bullied or who's going to be victims of abuse and things like that. So even though it might seem a little dry to be categorizing relationships in this way, it's a big part of what goes on in understanding the dynamics, right? Because again, we have to operationalize something in order to be able to have a common definition so that we can try to measure it, right? Even something as maybe abstract as a relationship, right? So one thing I want to mention here is that even in preschool and young children, like, 3, 4, and a little bit older than that, they form real friendships. Their friendships and their relationships matter. They're notoriously fickle, right? Someone might be my best friend tomorrow or today, and tomorrow it's a different person. Everybody might be my best friend. It's not that they're not important. It's they maybe don't have the complexity and the nuance that older relationships do. But they still are able to talk about that. And it's interesting another fun thing to Google is videos of kids being asked, what is a friend, right? Because that is something where they can, it's very interesting, I think, to talk about that. Whoops. It's very interesting to talk about that and see like at different developmental levels, how kids define that. But really, we define friendship as a commitment based on trust, especially when we get into school age kids who are able to do that, right? They're able to articulate, this person I trust, or this is why I tell them things, or I like to do things with them, and this is why I don't. Whereas you'll remember from the previous lecture, younger children, preschool and younger, it's mostly based on mutual interest. And that's kind of why it fluctuates, because everybody might be interested in doing something different day by day. If you'll remember in previous chapters, when we talk about the development of the self and identity, the more complex that is, in addition to our language and our emotional intelligence and even cognitive abilities, right? We can those abstract things. We understand rules better. We understand the give and take. We understand cause and effect. So if somebody does something to hurt me, right, younger kids attribute that to more hostile intentions, whereas someone older might understand it's an accident. Doesn't mean you like them, but it might not break a relationship. Just like they can understand, yes, that did have malicious intent, and I don't like you because of that. Whereas this person was nice to me, or when I was nice to them, they responded, right? And there's that reciprocal nature of the relationship that develops. And so friendship's the first part of that, like it says on here, that commitment based on trust. Peer relationships in middle childhood, this is where we first tend to see the idea of social status, right? How accepted am I by my peers? How rejected am I by my peers? And that's called sociometry, and that's where we are categorizing and measuring, right? And it's this technique, this research technique to look at their status within a group, right? So we look at one high school, right? Or one class or something like that. And we can kind of see what's the distribution, and does that hold across cultures or across the nation, or, even throughout the same school, right? And that's where it becomes useful to kind of compare and say, where are now the large trends in middle childhood and adolescent relationships that we can see? Again, going back to the identity of the understanding of the self and my identity, and cognitively, right, at middle childhood, this is when I'm able to understand those secondary emotions like shame and guilt, right? So something like, I did this and my friends all thought it was funny, but not in a good way, and I understand they were laughing at me and not with me, and I feel shame, and we kind of start forming these hierarchies, right? This is why our relationships are able to get a little bit more complex, because we understand and we're able to compare ourselves. Remember, younger children overestimate their abilities and their status and how much people like them, because they're pretty egocentric and they don't really compare. They don't have that capacity yet. But as we're able to compare ourselves to others, or compare two groups of other people, right? Johnny is nice and Jimmy is mean, right? And something like that for this reason. That's when, okay, now we're starting to organize ourselves based on certain dynamics, right? So this is kind of a good graphic to talk about different sociometric statuses, right? The way that it's measured is researchers ask people who they like best, who's high in peer acceptance, and who they like least, right? They don't say, here's a list of kids and rate everybody, right? Because they're also looking for the kids that like nobody's asking, if nobody mentions, right? And you can see a list down here of all of these different kinds of kids. This is really important stuff. This is going to be on your test. I think it's really important to understand this stuff because it gives us a good framework for understanding the complexities, right, of adolescent and middle childhood relationships. Okay, so we're going to go through these real quick, and we're going to talk about what they are and kind of what kind of some examples of like who might fit into this category. A couple things that I want to talk about while we do this. I'm gonna just click through this whole slide, and then I'll go back to the other one to cover some things that aren't on this slide, right? Is this idea of popularity and rejection, right? So popularity is how often were you rated as someone that your peers liked? Rejection is how often were you rated as someone that your peers did not like? Popular pro-social children is one group, and there's also popular antisocial children. And we'll go back here in a minute, like I said, to the graphic and look at it. You can also find that in your book on page 468. It's figure 12.4. Right? If you're using the ebook too, that might be easier with the figure number. So think about your own high school or middle school experience when we're talking about this, right? There probably were some people that were pretty popular. Everyone thought was cool, right? Whatever cool means in your school, who were nice. Everyone likes him because he's good at stuff. He's smart, or she's really kind, low on aggression, right? She's not mean, even though she's popular. Those were like the prom, maybe not the prom queen in your school, but you know, that's somebody who people really like because she just treats everybody the same, or it isn't mean, right? You knew there were people like that popular antisocial that, yeah, they're probably high on this hierarchy, right? That your stereotypical mean jock, right? Guy that's the captain of the basketball team or the track star who like thinks that he's hot stuff and kind of treats people like beneath him, right? Well, that's antisocial behavior, right? But they still have some sort of athletic or academic ability or some other sort of popular thing that people value, right? That gets them rated as like, oh yeah, everybody likes that guy. Even if it's, okay, I'm using my aggression to kind of get my own way and climb that social ladder, so to speak, right? Whereas popular pro-social children are going to be nice, but they're going to also have something that's sought out. This seems really shallow maybe at first. There's a lot of different people that can fit into this, right? It doesn't have to just be like, again, think of your, you know, your high school drama show and those kind of people, although they might fall in here as well. I mean, this can be some generally good, nice, and helpful people, right? It says on there, even helpfulness is good. It doesn't have to be that you are awesome at something. Although those stereotypical people are also going to fall into that range as well. Rejection, right, is the opposite of that. We can have people who are rejected because of those low social skills. Again, typically they are either mean, right, as it says on here, annoying. There's something about them not fitting in well, but socially unskilled in some way, right? Doesn't have to be a clinical thing, although it can be, right? But these are people who kind of call attention to themselves for antisocial behavior, right? And they don't have something balancing it out that makes them popular. Rejected withdrawn children tend to be your, you know, if we're going to use the stereotypical terms again, right, your wallflowers, right? Or the people who, you know, they're weird and they make everyone feel a little creepy maybe, or when they do speak up, it's to talk about, you know, whatever weird book they're reading or something. Again, not to throw shade at anybody or make fun of you if that was you as a high school, or maybe it's still you now, you know. But chances are if you're reading Kafka in middle school or high school, and anytime anyone brings it up, you're going to sneer at whatever books they're reading. Okay, people aren't going to like you very much, right? Like that's not going to happen, right? Or, you know, if you dress in a way that's very, very different from everybody else, but still kind of calls attention to you, as we get older, hopefully we learn that doesn't really matter. But especially in middle and high school, right? We're still developing that frontal lobe. We're still developing some of that empathy maybe, or because we're very egocentric, right? In our adolescent stage, it's like, I'm all about getting and fitting in with the group, right? Which is another reason why this is helpful, because we know that about us adolescents. A high priority with them is finding a group and sticking within it. And a lot of people want to fit to the norm. Others might find a niche group, but they're still wanting to stick in that group. And we'll talk about that a little bit. So those are your rejected withdrawn children. So you can see there are two kinds of popular kids, right? There are the popular kids who have these desirable characteristics, and they are low on aggression, so they're nice, right? Which is an oversimplification, but that's what we're going to use. Or there are the popular antisocial children who have, again, some desirable quality, but they have a little bit more of that social aggression, right? Where I'm gonna do, you know, use that to get my way in some way. And then our rejected children, these are the ones that people specifically mentioned, nobody likes them or I don't like them. And they say they're rejected either because they are antisocial without that redeeming quality, seemingly redeeming quality, right? or they're rejected because they have something about them that they don't engage, right? Or they're low social skills, but it's not that aggressive kind. They're withdrawn, right? Either one of those is going to separate you from your peers, right? So we've put people into this category, and there's a couple more categories I'm going to hop back and talk about, and then come back to this slide and talk about rejection sensitivity and some of the research results, right? So we've got we've got our high peer acceptance, we've got our low peer acceptance. If you look right up here at the top is the high peer acceptance, down here is the low. We have peer rejection is high and peer rejection is low. So these are the things. I want you to remember those other ones because those are good examples. But for the test, right, this is what we're wanting these categories to talk about. So popular children, we call people popular, and we're breaking it down, right? We kind of talked about what means you're popular. As far as just those two metrics, those two scales, right, you're going to be high in peer acceptance and low in peer rejection. Not many people saying that they don't like you. Lots of people saying that they do. Rejected children, right, are going to be in the opposite end of the spectrum. High in peer rejection. Lots of people saying, I don't like that kid. I don't like that girl or whatever, right? And low on peer acceptance. Not many people balancing out by also saying they like you. Okay, kind of in the middle of this, controversial children. These are children who are rated high on peer acceptance, right? Also high on peer rejection. So, you know, even if I'm that popular antisocial kid, I'm probably still having much, much more high acceptance than I am rejection. But maybe I fall into this range where I'm very high in acceptance. I'm also high on rejected. Again, it depends on the makeup maybe of the group that's rating you. But, you know, a lot of people think you're great. A lot of people think you kind of suck, right? And you kind of fall in this where it's depends on who you ask, right? On the opposite end of that, we have our neglected. And this is why I was saying this is why we don't just list everybody and ask, because researchers are interested in knowing who just slips through the cracks. Who does nobody even think about, right? Those are that are low on peer rejection, but also low on peer acceptance. Nobody has any problems with them, but nobody's going out of their way to say, yeah, that's my guy or that's my girl, right? And then we have our average children, which is where, you know, we kind of fall here in the middle, and it's a little of both. It's a mixed bag. Maybe we're not, you know, if we're thinking it's a bell curve, right? You know, I'm maybe not on either extreme. I'm kind of somewhere here in the middle, and most of us probably fall there, right? Or there's a lot of people there. This doesn't necessarily go on a bell curve, but that's just the metaphor I chose. Probably a poor one since it's statistics and has significance, right? But you can imagine that, right? There's some people, it's like, oh yeah, people mostly like them or they mostly don't. But like, if we're putting people literally on a ladder, like they're not popular, right? They haven't met that cutoff, but they're still liked, right? Or they might be not very much liked, but they're not so unliked that they're rejected or neglected, okay? So let's come back, compare to this again, right? You can see how popularity and rejection, right? Those are our two sides of it, right? And then we can break those down a little further, right? So then we want to look at and measure rejection sensitivity. To what extent is a child affected by the rejection of others? Because we all know people like this, right? We know the ones that are deeply hurt by it, and it bothers them and they think about it a lot, and we know the ones who don't care. So if you think about your rejected, withdrawn, right, or even you're neglected, do they care? Does it bother them? You know, and that's something we can look at and say, okay, if you have high rejection sensitivity and you're in one of these highly rejected categories, okay, that's going to create problems for you, right? Because there's going to be emotional distress with that. Whereas we might have another kid that like, yeah, you're definitely one of the weirdos, but you don't care. You're happy, right? You're like, I could care less what anybody else thinks. Some of us arrive there a little bit earlier than others. Some of us never arrive there. Most of us care at least a little bit what some people think of us, right? But maybe we have a little bit lower sensitivity to that. And so it doesn't affect us as much to be in one of these like bad categories, right? So research, right, has focused mostly on individual characteristics that throw people or tend to put people in one of these categories, but group characteristics are important too, right? Because there's also, you could have people rate like overall groups. Like, what do you think of the kids in band? What do you think of the kids in the chess club? What do you think of the kids in the drama club, or the kids who, you know, hang out behind the school, you know, and, you know, play hacky sack or whatever, right? I mean, like, just however you want to define it, right? We can kind of say, okay, what are the characteristics of these general groups? And how does that help us understand how people are defining themselves, right? Because even if we're going back to Erikson, right, this is the age when we're defining ourselves. And so as we get in middle childhood and get into adolescence, and so understanding the categories that adolescents seem to divide themselves into on their own, right, is important for us there. So again, page 468, kind of review those other ones, and then remember kind of to break it down a little bit more. I said we were going to talk about examples as well. So if we're talking about our popular kids, right, that's going to be exactly what we talked about. You know, think of the people that are good at everything, and they may or may not be nice, but they have something that they are recognized as valuable or desirable, right? Maybe they just have a lot of money. There's people like that, right? And it's like they're cool and they throw cool parties, even though they kind of suck, right? That's another, again, I'm talking in stereotypes because these are easy to remember. Again, if you throw awesome parties in high school, not knocking you at all, right? For our rejected children, right? Those are the kids, I mean, maybe they're just a jerk, your standard bully who's like, you know, rejected for whatever reason. Again, it could be socioeconomic status. It could be just how you act, that you might not have something that like contributes to the school culture and you're still acting kind of like a jerk, or you just totally withdrawn from people and don't interact with anybody. Our controversial children are going to be those kids probably that are, you know, your James Dean, your rebel without a cause. Like, oh, okay, I've got, you know, I maybe have a little bit of a temper and I fly off the handle, but I'm pretty cool, right? I play the guitar or something like that, or I seem very complicated. And that's attractive because I seem very mature and older. And so that's going to be someone who, okay, maybe a lot of other people don't like you because you're mean to the nerds or whatever, but you're kind of cool. Like every character that James Franco's ever played in a movie, just about, right? Unless he's a stoner, might fall into this category. I'm thinking mostly Freaks and Geeks, but maybe some other ones too, where it's like he's kind of a jerk. And some people are going to like him and some won't. I think you guys are old enough to remember the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man before they redid it and then redid it again. Like, he's Harry Osborn, right? He's got a lot of money. He's pretty smart, but he's kind of a weirdo and kind of a jerk, and not everybody kind of thinks a little too much of himself. That might be someone who's an example of controversial. Neglected, you just fade into the background, right? Again, I'm not dressing in all leather. I don't have piercings. I don't have tattoos. I don't, you know, carry around a copy of the Communist Manifesto and talk about it whatever chance I have. All things that no one really wants to interact with you for, right? I just kind of fade into the background. Okay. And no one really rates me one way or the other. And they might not even feel like I know I'm there. So those are your examples of controversial, neglected. And then of course your average, right? Just standard, whatever. Man, I want to use TV references and I realize how much older I am than all of you. And so it's hard for me to pick these out, but your kids that just, you know, some people like them, some people don't. It's okay to be right there in the middle. I want to say Doug Funny from the cartoon Doug, but that's like 90s. And like, you guys might not even been born when Doug was a TV show. So go Google it, I guess. And you'll be like, oh yeah, that's the most average dude of all time. No one who wears sweater vests can be too popular or can have enough like of an interesting personality to be hated as well, right? So just go look up Doug and you'll know exactly what an average person looks like there. Okay, so moving on. That's how we kind of define and categorize. Again, I think that's really important because you can see all the research implications, right? We can say what kind of kids, what kind of behaviors tend to make someone feel rejected, and then can we predict their outcomes based on that or something like that, right? So there's obviously other factors just then how you fit into your school culture that determine your relationships, right? And again, another thing I'll add here, trying to stay on topic, but getting off of it a little bit, maybe we'll look at, are there cross, you know, group relationships, right? So are popular kids ever friends with the rejected kids? Okay, well, yes. What then are the individual characteristics or group characteristics that might define that? And once we've categorized people, right, then we can select our sample more effectively if we're looking into these dynamics. Again, why is this important? Well, if you work at a school, that's important to know. If you are a therapist, right, or someone, you might not use these specific terms in therapy, but the research that you're consuming is based on this kind of stuff, right? And telling you, okay, I want to know how to help somebody navigate their adolescent relationships effectively. That research has come from how do we help people, how do we identify people with a high rejection sensitivity, and what can you do? What are some interventions, right, or some strategies that person can use to either lower that and be like, I don't care as much if I'm a little rejected, or how do I exhibit some more pro-social behaviors and help myself out? So moving on from that, finally, sorry, really interesting stuff to me, maybe is not as much to you. This idea of gender in play, right? Because there are gender differences in peer relationships. Again, I feel compelled to say this every time. One, you know, your biological sex and your gender you identify with may not line up with this, right? And therefore, okay, where's the research going to show how this works? It tends to go with the gender you identify with a little bit more because you tend to fall a little bit more into those stereotypical categories. Of course, that doesn't apply to everybody, whether you are cisgendered or not, and whether or not you highly identify, you know, not everybody highly identifies with the stereotypes of it. Again, these are broad terms, lots of research that's done on this. So again, it's not applicable to everyone all the time, but it's also not useless, okay? So typically, younger kids, you know, early childhood, going into middle childhood, we see a lot of gender segregation, right? Boys are friends with boys, girls are friends with girls, and not a lot of crossover. There's a lot of different reasons. One, typical play styles is important for this, right? Think about stereotypically how boys like to play, right? They may be a little bit rough and tumble. They may be playing a little bit more contact sports, maybe. Although I know we have athletes in this class that don't shy away from that. We have guys that don't play a contact sport too. So again, I realize these stereotypes break down on the individual level. That's true with all group research, right? But that rough and tumble, the hierarchical nature of gender relationships, we'll talk about this a little bit more for boys, not super attractive to young girls all the time. So maybe they don't want to join in that group. And the same thing with guys, like they're wanting to run around maybe a little bit more. And so I don't want to do things that typically, stereotypically, right, girls are wanting to do. The big thing too is different communication and response patterns, right? Young women tend to have a communication style that is more suggestion rather than command, whereas boys tend to have one that's a little bit more like, hey, do this, don't do that, I don't like that, a little bit more explicit. This isn't to say that women are like naggy and like, oh, they won't ever get to the point. Again, we talk about social hierarchies. If boys tend to be more hierarchical, right, a ladder, that means, okay, yes, I'm above, I can tell you what to do. You're below, you can be explicit. There's rules for what you do. Whereas girls tend to have a more circular, right, inclusive social hierarchy, which means, okay, I suggest to you because it's more about an inner out than it is above or below. I'm not above you. I can't safely say this. And if I don't match the communication style of our group, then, okay, maybe I'm not welcome here anymore, right? And again, people want to have relationships, so they work within those rules. And of course, there's cross-cultural differences in the way that boys and girls play. That's not true everywhere, but that tends to be thinking grade school, right? Like first, second, third, fourth grade, like this is how we tend to segregate ourselves. And, I like to think of it as building blocks, right? I learn to play, just like in play, I play next to somebody and then I'm able to cooperatively play with you. I might learn to play with people that are more similar to me before I reach across, that gender aisle, right? And start playing with somebody a little different. Okay. So we move in adolescence. What's the first thing that happens? Well, we tend to see more sophisticated and deeper relationships forming, which means that one high quality friendship is going to be more supportive to teens than many superficial friends, even though things like Facebook and Twitter and Instagram and TikTok or whatever, right? Tell us that more is always better. Research has borne out time and time again. I think if you ask just about anybody, they will tell you that high quality friendship is way better than all the randos on Facebook that I'm friend with that I don't even remember where this person came from. Or if you're like me, I've been out of high school for a while. There's people whose names I don't even remember that I'm friends with in high school. And so, like, do I care how many of those people are friends with me? No, I'm also not on Facebook. So I'm a bad example, but well, technically I guess I am, but I don't ever look at it. Other than to see where food trucks are. That's the only thing, which again tells you how old I am, right? If that's, I guess, what I'm using instead of some other social media. But all that to say that those are the things that really form lasting bonds and are a better part of our support system than a whole bunch of others. Even though adolescents will be engaged in trying to fit into a large group sometimes, what we found is the ones that do better and thrive a little bit more, right, are the ones that have a few high quality friendships, like at least one, right? And you think about exactly what you're thinking about defines a high quality friendship, right? A lot of trust, a lot of emotional understanding, a lot of mutually beneficial factors to it. Intimacy tends to be more central in girls' friendships than boys when they're forming those high quality friendships. Again, think about communication styles, think about the social hierarchy there, right? Like closeness is a little bit more important to girls. But boys tend to have larger groups and are more willing to allow new members, right? It's less threatening to let you in because you're going to start on the bottom, right? Or if you're clearly awesome and you're going to be to the top, at the hierarchy, why wouldn't we want you in our group, right? Whereas girls, again, the circular nature means letting somebody in, they're all on equal footing. If intimacy is what I value, you don't want, and it's totally fine. You don't want to be emotionally intimate with a person you've just met. I'm not going to tell you all my secrets, right? I'm not going to tell you everything I think yet because it takes time to build that up with good reason. Okay, again, it's not a knock against, and boys aren't just dumb animals who is like, cool, if you can throw the football really far, you get to be my friend. Or if you are awesome at Fortnite, then we're going to be best buds. Like that doesn't matter, right? Or I can beat you at Fortnite, so let's be friends, right? It's more, it's not that it's more complex than that. It's not an issue of quality, right? Or good or bad. It's just a difference in, it is a qualitative difference, right? In that it's a different in kind. But so both boys and girls, though, have friends who tend to be similar to themselves, even at adolescence, right? Initially, that is through selection, right? I become friends with you in the 3rd grade because we like the same stuff. By the time we're in the 11th grade, okay, and we've stayed friends, right? We've influenced each other. We've taken on each other's interests and each other's cares and each other's opinions, maybe a little bit. This is true of anyone you know, right? Think about someone you know that's been married for a long time. If we're not even talking peer relationships there, but like they tend to take on each other's qualities a little bit and understand, know, and more about that. Like my wife knows way more about Star Wars and Dungeons and Dragons than she did, 8 or 9 years ago, right? Because the longer we've been married, the more I've, either forced her to listen to me talk about it or forced her to try something, right? And the same thing. So I wouldn't say I exercise a lot, but I probably exercise a little bit more because it's important to my wife and it's now important to me. So, you take on each other's qualities. Same things with friends, right? I've got a buddy who's an aeronautical engineer and now he makes video games, and another buddy who's super into airplanes because his dad was in the Air Force. They talk about it all the time. I know nothing about airplanes, but because I've been around them for a long time, I know a little bit more about that. And that stuff is a little more interesting to me, right? This is what we're talking about. We initially became friends back in the 6th grade because we both like to play video games, right? And now it's way more about other things as time has gone on. Okay, so in this adolescent world, right, we talked about group characteristics not being the only thing, or individual characteristics not being the only thing that's important, but also group characteristics. So how do we define those? How do we, kind of categorize them? Cliques, right? You all heard the word before. It's kind of got a negative connotation for a good reason, but small groups of friends, right, who spend time together and develop close relationships, which can be good, all right? This can help with loneliness. The dark side of it, right, is that it also increases some externalizing behaviors. This is your Mean Girls situation, right? Which again is hyperbolic and for humor, but this is exactly what happens. This is why we don't like cliques, right? Where it's like we're super, super close, which is a good thing. We just talked about that. Maybe we're a little too harsh on other people because of that, right? Maybe because I have this, I don't evaluate my own behavior enough and I kind of act in a way that's not very good because my group is okay with it. Crowds, exactly what they sound like, large ones based on reputation, okay? Some shared stereotypes. So all, again, of your TV drama, your Riverdale groups, right? Like your jocks and your band nerds and all that stuff, right? Those exactly what a crowd is. Members don't necessarily spend time together, but we've got these external superficial things that identify us together, right? That helps with early identity formation. Think about it. I'm trying to figure out who I am. Okay, let me join this group just based on this activity. Okay, I've got some things that can kind of sometimes physically hang on me, right? That help me understand a little bit about where I fit in the world, what my place is, what I'm good at. And over time, that becomes more complex. All right. So what comes with that, though, as we're dividing ourselves into popular and rejected and antisocial and, in this clique and in this crowd? Well, peer pressure, right? It tends to be a little more subtle, more than overt. When teens, when they're asked about this and they report on it, they're like, I don't often have somebody like cornering me and telling me to do something, smoke weed with me right now or I'll beat you up. But it's more like, oh, you don't? Okay. Now you're not invited because we don't know if you're cool or not, right? It's that kind of thing. So, tends to be a little bit more subtle, and susceptibility to it peaks in that early adolescence, decreases as we get older. 2 reasons, right? Stronger identity, hopefully, that we formed. And so if that's not part of my identity, I'm not as interested in exploring it or interested in trying it on. Remember, if I'm those 2 frameworks of identity, right? How strong is my identity? If I have a strong identity and I'm not searching, then I'm not going to be trying anything else. Peer pressure ain't going to work on me. If I have a pretty strong identity, but maybe I'm looking around, over time, I might be more susceptible. Of course, if I am weak on what identity I have, I'm actively exploring, I might try everything and be super susceptible to it, right? And of course, then cognitively and neurologically, what's going on? Our frontal lobe is getting more and more complex, right? We're able to better think through those hypothetical situations and be like, well, what's going to be the outcome of this if I do it? Well, if I know the outcome, I don't have to try it, right? In order to do it. I don't have to go to that party. I don't have to eat lunch with you a couple times to figure out that I'm not going to like that, right? Okay. Or that I am going to love it and I definitely want to do it either way, right? And so as we get older, we get better and we're less susceptible to peer pressure. I mean, think about you guys, right? Late stage adolescence, how many of you say peer pressure is a big part of what goes on in your life right now? It never goes away completely, but probably not as big as when you were 14 or 15, right? Or 13, right? So okay, so the last couple of things we want to talk about are romantic relationships. I know we've talked about this, right, when we were talking about attachment. We go from parents to peers to romantic relationships. What does that look like in adolescence? Because that's pretty much the only time we have it. Maybe there's some cute little, this is my boyfriend, girlfriend when you're younger, but this is basically the first time that it starts, right? The way it begins, young teens begin to form their first mixed gender groups in adolescence. Remember, we talked about in middle childhood, it tends to be more about your same sex peers, right? Within group, individuals begin to pair up. So typically, again, right, crowds or cliques or however we're defining it, we're not seeing a lot of I almost say cross-pollination, which would have been really hilarious, right? But we're not seeing a lot of cross relationships there, right? People moving from one group to the other. So it tends to be within groups. Think about your own life. This happened to me. We had our little church youth group thing in our bigger school. We all went to church together. So we were kind of a little group. Everybody started dating each other within that group, right? About the time people started dating for the first times. And that's where those romantic relationships grow out of. Again, just like we did with peers, teens choose to form others who are more similar to themselves, right? Less things to navigate. I can practice more. What are the rules and the rhythms and the scripts of this kind of relationship without having to also learn a whole bunch of new stuff, right? And figure out how you tick, because I kind of know how you tick already. Boys tend to choose partners their own age a little bit more. Girls often prefer somewhat older partners. Again, communication style, right, is going to make sense with that. And so that tends to be how it works, right? And girls value intimacy. So someone who's a little bit more developed emotionally is probably going to be able to provide that a little bit more. Also, if you'll remember back when we were talking physically about puberty, girls tend to develop, they hit puberty sooner, right? And so they're going to be seen as a potential object of romantic relationship by older people more than boys tend to, right? And you know this, right? How many people do you know, relationships in general, where even at your age in college, right, where it's an older girl with a younger guy? Not always, doesn't happen very often, right? For a reason. Okay. Now this picture has nothing to do. I just want to include it. I know I can't see you to see that you're laughing at it, but I know you will because it's hilarious for two reasons. One, look at that guy. Again, apologies to anyone who ever looked like this or if you currently do. Two, I don't have a daughter. But even not having a daughter, I look at this and I just get a little aggravated because I'm like, that is not how I would want the person my daughter would choose to be dating. I don't, again, I don't even have a teenager of any kind. So either I'm just like an old fuddy-duddy or whatever, but I look at this and everything about it aggravates me. Like the way she's hanging off of him, the way he's looking at her, and mostly his haircut. Like something I'm working on in my personal life, judging people based on their haircuts in general. But I mean, come on, right? Look at this kid. So it's in the book and it was included in the slideshow and I think it's funny. So I feel like it's worth sharing with everybody, right? Okay. So, we're getting on towards the end of this here. So a couple other things when we're talking about relationships in adolescence are important to remember, right? We've talked about this before. The quality of a familial relationship earlier is related to more healthy romantic relationships, right? Because we're building those unconscious scripts. Like, how do relationships work? What do I understand about how this works? I'm carrying that framework with me into my romantic relationships. I don't start from scratch. Also from that, correlated with that is the quality of peer relationships. The better relationship I have with my family, the better relationship I have with my peers, the better my romantic relationships are going to go. Makes sense, right? I know how to make a relationship work. So adding a new layer to it, there's a learning curve there, right? But I'm not having to start at square one. Think about attachment, right? If I assume people are going to hurt me and I'm wary and therefore I'm clingy and I don't want you to leave, that's not a great quality in our parents because it means daycare is a hard thing. Right? It's hard when we're not securely attached. When we're not securely attached, it's hard with our peer relationships because I tend to I don't play hard to get enough and nobody likes that person that's like calling and texting them all the time about what they're doing. And you're like, dude, chill a little bit. Like, I'm not going to leave you out. Like, it's fine. Like that's uncomfortable. Right. And then nobody likes that in a boyfriend or girlfriend, right? Nobody wants somebody like checking your phone to see if you're texting other girls or, texting you all the time just to say I miss you. Or you're like, hey, we went on a date yesterday and now I'm hanging out and we're going to have a girls' night, or I'm just doing homework or something and you won't leave me alone. Like, right. But that's that person's mode of operation. That's what they've been taught. That's what they've learned is how to maintain a relationship and all through their life. Right. And you're going to bring it into those romantic ones. Here's the hard part about this, right? As we're defining with these relationships, we're asking adolescents and things about it. They're pretty clearly defined on their peer relationships. Romantic ones are less clearly defined, right? So if we're going to apply some sociometry to romantic relationships, that's harder, right? Because they change so quickly, first of all, especially early adolescence, right? I mean, you might date someone for 2 weeks and then now I'm dating someone else and all this kind of stuff. But, what does it mean when we're dating? Does dating mean that we hang out at school and we sit next to each other and we hold hands? Or does that mean we've actually been on a date? Does that mean we're physically involved, right? Does that mean we're exclusive or not? I mean, DTR is important, for adults. It's also important for this. And if we're going to research it, I mean, teenagers are terrible at DTR, right? So trying to measure that stuff is a little harder than it is the other things because, again, it's less complex. They're better. They have more practice with friendships, so they're better able to define and report on those, right? And really the only way to know about this stuff is to ask somebody. Thankfully, teenagers, for the most part, are good at telling us this kind of stuff. And the last thing I want to talk about real quick, as we enter romantic relationships, not that people can't be the victims of, abuse before, but this is where we start to see our first kind of that not first sexual abuse, but if you've been the victim of physical or sexual abuse growing up, you're at an increased risk of either experiencing it or perpetuating violence within an intimate relationship. Why is that? Again, the pattern that's been solidified in your internal working model for relationships, right? You fall into one of those roles, probably. Depends on how you respond to the trauma that happens. But we see that correlation over time there. Okay, that's peer relationships. There'll be more information coming about finishing up the semester, but please look through this. Again, I apologize. It's even harder to talk slow when there's no one to look at. So I know this is probably, you're going to put it on like 3/4 speed, or if you're insane, you'll speed it up. I don't know. You'll try either way. So I apologize for that. But thanks, guys, for sticking through these. Thanks for paying attention to them. Refer back to your book, of course, as always, for more information. And if you have any questions, let me know. Thanks.